Talofa Kiarana Mari, Fakalofa Atu, Maloilele, hello, Olketa, and welcome everyone to this side event. We're excited to have you online. My name is Lysiana Tananga, and I have the honor of moderating today's virtual trade Talanoa. Talanoa is our Pacific way of sharing ideas and skills and dialogue, and this is how we will conduct this side event. We are grateful to ANTEC for availing us this opportunity to be able to come and talk about the work that we're doing in the Pacific. Our Talanoa today will focus on leveraging partnership for enhanced trade facilitation and regional integration in the Pacific. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to have an impact on our Pacific Island countries and has caused disruptions to the supply chain. And the supply chain disruptions have underscored the need for digital and paperless trade procedures. And so through the Talanoa today, we want to reflect an approach adopted by the PACER Plus implementation unit to promote synergies with development partners in advancing digital reforms in the Pacific and to promote the exchange of best practices and lessons learned on trade facilitation reforms. The format of our trade Talanoa today is that we will have 30 minutes curated questions to the panelists, and then another 15 minutes questions from you, the audience, before we wrap up this session. In and between the Talanoa, we will provide you with short videos on the work we do in the Pacific. So we, once again, welcome to this virtual side event. But before I proceed, let me just provide a few housekeeping matters. And I know that many of us have been on Zoom platform, but just for this purpose, we will have a question and answer sessions after the panel discussions. There is a box on question and answer, so should you have any question for the panelists, feel free to write them before we reach the question and answer sessions, and then we will proceed to tackle those questions during those sessions. So before we proceed with the program proper, allow us, please, to provide you a brief background on PACER Plus.
Trade has always been a way of life in the Pacific. Our people have been trading goods, services, and making investments since our ancestors settled the vast whenua that is the Pacific. We have unique products that can be enjoyed by both large economies and by our Pacific brothers and sisters.
The good news is now there are new ways to connect all of our island goods, and that is with the trade and development deal that allows Pacific people to do what we've always done best, connect with each other, and to people wanting to experience the best of what we have to offer. PACER Plus is a milestone trade and development agreement that will make trade so much easier between Pacific nations and even further afield. More people in Australia, New Zealand, and potentially globally can buy or experience Pacific products. The news keeps getting better because all of that sticky red tape and those tricky trade barriers will be reduced. This is a great opportunity for Pacific businesses to flourish, to create more Pacific jobs, and to build a future where our economies can thrive.
Like many countries, Pacific nations face economic challenges, mainly because of scale, resources, access, and capacity. PACER Plus provides our Pacific Island with the opportunity to develop sustainable solutions that are fit for purpose.
PACER Plus recognizes what we have and reinforces our connectivity across the Moana and understands how our unique ways of living can help each other prosper. The Pacific countries that already signed up to PACER Plus are already getting lots of benefits as part of the development funding. Some of these benefits range from online trade portals to making trading easier, customs help, legal drafting, and revenue planning. Once in force, Pacific countries will get to work with us at the PACER Plus implementation unit to help get it all up and running. Because it's all about helping Pacific economies grow. So what's important now is that we need to get this agreement into action so all of the benefits can be released.
PACER Plus also provides the opportunity to improve the lives and wellness of our Pacific people and communities. It builds upon other trade agreements in the region and ensures activities implemented will assist with economic recovery in the midst of COVID and climate change.
Participants, we hope that that video has provided you some context, and we will now proceed to our trade Talanoa. Before I proceed again, let me just note again to all the participants that are logged in online today. At the end of the Talanoa, we will have a question and answer session, and if you have any question for the panelists, please type it in the Q&A section of the virtual platform. We also welcome general comments and reflections on the presentations, and that can be typed in the chat as well. Our PPIU team online will be capturing all of these questions for the sessions after the trade Talanoa. Let's get started. It is my pleasure to briefly introduce the panelists to you. So this afternoon we have 4 panelists. First is Mr. Roy Langolango. You've seen him in the video, the head of the PACER Plus implementation unit based here in our PS Samoa. Mr. William Gain, billed to many of us in the Pacific, is the World Bank's global lead trade facilitation, customs reforms, and border management. We have Stanley Tree from Vanuatu, Vanuatu's National Single Window Project Manager and the trendsetter in development of electronic single window in the Pacific. And so we are glad to have you, Stanley. And Mr. J.V. Santos, the Escuda Regional Coordinator for the Pacific. We are quite glad for the PPIU to have such privileged speakers and trade facilitations, specialists in the room today to share some experience. And so, like I said, it's a Talanoa, so let's just make it a little bit more casual. You can smile a little bit for the panelists as well as we begin this Talanoa. So the first questions that I have for the panelists, and we can start with you, Roy, and then to Bill, and then Stan, and then JV. How is your organization or the project in which you are managing for the Pacific, managing in the Pacific, expediting trade facilitation reforms in the Pacific region?
Talofa everyone. Kia ora, kia orana, Maori. Thank you, Lai, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So in terms of the question, the PACER Plus implementation unit, we are new on the scene. So we are looking at opportunities to leverage off other activities that have already been conducted in the region. And I think that's what this Talanoa is all about. So because PACER Plus implementation unit is quite new, the agreement came into force in 2020 when a number of countries signed the agreement. And so when we've come into the scene, we obviously got people like Bill Gates with the World Bank. There's a whole lot of people working in this region in terms of trade facilitation. So the big thing for us as a new unit in the Pacific is to collaborate and look for partnerships with agencies like the World Bank, UNCTAD, Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and those sort of agencies that have already been in the region for a long time. So I think for PACER Plus, it's actually coordinating with the implementing partners, looking for opportunities where we can avoid duplication of some of the activities in terms of trade facilitation, aid for trade, and that helps countries in terms of reducing the strain on their resources. So I think for PACER Plus, because we're quite new, there's an opportunity for us to be able to stand back and sort of learn from some of the agencies that have already been doing this sort of work in the region, but also looking at opportunities where we can add value to some of those activities in terms of trade facilitation. And one of the unique things about PACER Plus is that we have been set up to implement PACER Plus, and there are a lot of activities in the trade and goods space, trade services, investment, that cut across a lot of the trade facilitation activities in the Pacific. And so utilizing the expertise of World Bank, UNCTAD, and others in the region is going to be a key for the PACER Plus implementation unit to ensure that we're not duplicating and that we're able to collaborate and build those partnerships. Thank you.
And thank you, Roy. And Bill, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lai. Kia ora, talofa to everybody. It's really nice to be back in the region. back in my home region, that is, and even if it's virtual, it's definitely nice to connect with everybody. And it's also very, very nice to be part of the partnership, particularly with the PACER Plus implementation unit. And it's a new model and one that we value and really look forward to immensely, particularly working, together with the team, Roy, that you've put together in Samoa. The World Bank has quite a large footprint in the Pacific, particularly around trade facilitation and border management, providing support to implement the trade facilitation agreement, firstly, in Fiji, PNG, Vanuatu, Samoa, and Tonga, and PACER Plus, in partnership again with the PACER Plus implementation unit across member countries, with work beginning very shortly in Tuvalu. We have a workshop for next week organised to begin looking at expedited shipments for Tuvalu. And again, it's in partnership and with the team under Roy's leadership. I mean, we know PACER Plus is critical. It provides the enabling environment to implement trade facilitation and complements the trade facilitation agreement, which is the WTO agreement. And so together, the region will benefit from global expertise, global standards, and best practices, but with a Pacific context. And I think this is what is important and why leveraging together with not only the PACER Plus implementation unit, but the regional secretariats is really important to ensure that all reforms and implementation of global agreements and regional agreements are fit for purpose, and they actually connect to the region and to the specific uniqueness of the countries in the Pacific. Regional integration is important to leverage economies of scales, and we don't see any other region where it's more important than here in the Pacific. We're working with PIFs as well and SPC, but with PIFs, we're working on the development of a trade facilitation regional strategy. And I'll expand more on that later in the session during this talanoa, because it is a very important and critical framework that will bind together a lot of the work that not only what the World Bank is doing, but what our other development partners like UNCTAD, OCO, PACER Plus, the EU, etc. And finally, the uniqueness of the region has benefited in the establishment of regional institutions. Again, like PIFs, OCO, and SPC, and having a role for those institutions connected to the sustainability and longevity of trade facilitation reforms will again be a critical way to ensure the benefits are accrued by both traders and the public sector. Thank you, Lai.
And thank you, Bill. Stan, if you do want to contribute to the questions, and then to JV. Thank you.
Thank you, Lai, and thank you for having Vanuatu in this talanoa. Greetings to everyone. With regards to the question, I'm happy to share the practical solution that we have here in Vanuatu with the introduction of a single window system to expedite trade facilitation reforms. From what we observe is that with the introduction of the system, we were able to easily implement some of the article of the WTO trade facilitation agreement. For instance, we saw under Article 7 regarding the release and clearance of goods. The system has allowed traders to conduct pre-clearance of their consignments, make online payments directly to customs, while customs was able to release consignments under their control prior to completion of formalities. And this includes release of expedite shipments and perishables and so on. The system has also allowed customs to apply risk management in collaboration with the other border agencies. Now, with the border agencies using a single system with customs, it meant that they were able to conduct joint inspections with the other agencies, and this is facilitated with the use of a single system, and therefore it's done transparently, and it enhanced our border control. This initiative has therefore improved the cooperation between customs and the other border agencies, as recommended under Article 8 of the agreement. The capability of the system to allow supporting documents to be scanned and available online has not only facilitated trade, but has allowed the processes to be done in a contactless and paperless environment. Now, having supporting documents available online has also meant that for customs and the other agencies, they can conduct post-clearance audits seamlessly, and and then allows for trade to be facilitated at the point of clearance. And finally, with the use of the system, and as required under the trade agreement, we were able to, or customs was able to allow goods to be temporarily imported and exported, and enhance customs control. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today. Thank you for having UNCTAD and the ASICUDA program as part of this side event. Thank you to the PACER Plus Implementation Unit for inviting us. On the question of what we are doing to expedite trade facilitation reforms in the Pacific, in the ASICUDA program, we provide the expertise and the tools to implement customs-related trade facilitation measures. In the context of the PACER Plus agreement, as part of the readiness package, UNCTAD assistance was sought to fulfill the transparency obligation of the agreement. So this led to the development of the national trade information portals for 9 signatory countries of the agreement, and also a regional trade information portal where you can access each country's national portal. So this portal allows the countries to publish their trade procedures and update their regulatory requirements in real time. The other project that we are doing under the PACER Plus agreement is the deployment of ASICUDA World in 6 of the signatory countries. So one of the key factors to realizing the benefits of PACER Plus and any trade agreement in this regard is a well-functioning and a modernized border and customs procedures. So in line with the PACER Plus development and economic cooperation program on customs institutional strengthening and modernization, we are deploying ASICUDA World in the Cook Islands, Kiribati, Nauru, Niue, Tuvalu, and Tonga. And in fact, we recently went live in Kiribati and in Tuvalu with the system on the 1st year anniversary of the ratification of the agreement. So the deployment of the system is preceded by the streamlining and the simplification of the trade transactions, the processes, and the documents before automation is adopted. UNCTAD is also has been invited to be the implementing partner of the Pacific Regional Economic Integration Program. And in this, under this EU-funded project, we will be working with the 15 Pacific Island countries, so 14 plus Timor-Leste, to implement trade facilitation measures. To expedite trade facilitation reform, we follow the key principles of country ownership, capacity building, and engagement of all the stakeholders. So Stanley would know this by heart. We work with project teams. We we hold consultations, and we document the needs of the country. As Bill mentioned earlier, the solution has to be tailored according to each country's needs. So the reform has to be driven by national counterparts for it to be sustainable. And finally, I would just like to mention that at the request of UNCTAD member states and international organizations, so we continue to build new tools, new modules in the ASICUDA system to support paperless cross-border flows and also interoperability with other systems, to enhance the national systems, as well as to develop new ways to serve the trade community, such as the Vanuatu single window system. Thank you, Lai.
And thank you, panelists, for those questions. I think, and for the audience, I hope that in some way it's also sort of provided the background in which these gentlemen are here and in the work that they do in the Pacific. I'll move on very quickly and then now to the panelists, and just very succinct on 2 or 3 minutes response to COVID-19. I think COVID-19, as I initially said, has impacted the way we do business here in the Pacific. But very briefly, how has that? And perhaps these questions I will pose first to Stanley. How has that impacted customs and trade at the national level, and both positively and negatively in that, and then I will ask the other gentleman to just contribute to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lai. So though Vanuatu is still COVID-free, we have already been bracing ourselves to work under a COVID-19 restriction, so that we're ready whenever we have the virus. But already we're seeing the single window system allowing the participating regulatory agencies to be able to conduct the operation entirely online, so with no human contact. And we are also putting in place a process for online or electronic payments, which may or may not link directly to the system. However, funds can be transferred to allocated government bank accounts or even e-wallet payment facilities. And then for the import and export formalities to be completed, will be done after the payments can be verified by the agencies. So despite Vanuatu being COVID-free, we see the opportunity for Vanuatu and even other countries in the region to be able to embrace the culture of working online rather than the traditional way of doing business that we're so used to, which is in person and standing in queues and the use of paper. So maybe to answer to the question, we have not had the impact of COVID directly to the operations of customs and the other regulatory agencies, but we are preparing ourselves should we get the virus. Thank you, Lai.
Next, Stanley. I'll just pose the questions to Bill and to Roy and JV, if you just want to lean into that questions, from your view in the work that you do here in the Pacific, how has COVID-19 impacted the countries in terms of, customs and trade?
Maybe I can start off, Lai. Yeah, thanks for that, and great points, Stanley, I think, on the use of automation and the preparation that we've seen in the Pacific. COVID-19 crisis, has further underlined the importance of trade facilitation and border management, and the efficient and coordinated approach by border agencies to be ready to respond, at the time of crisis. The COVID-19 has had a severe impact really on the Pacific as a region, not necessarily at the individual national level, because we've seen some of the global influences come through and across into the region, particularly when it comes to the global supply chain and then the regional supply chain between the Pacific and Australia and New Zealand. And some of this will continue for some time. And with the continual lockdown and We've seen that in the Pacific with, Kiribati suddenly having to lock down, and the crisis in Tonga. It's not just COVID. It's actually been exacerbated by, natural disasters as well. However, the COVID situation has also provided a change in focus for countries, particularly in 3 or 4 specific areas. And we heard a little bit about this from Stanley, where there's a vision to allow and encourage, online practices, post-COVID. The 3 areas that are particularly important, and we've seen a real motivation to change and move forward with, is around border collaboration and coordination, integration of border agencies into the National Trade Facilitation Committees, and particularly the Ministry of Health, which wasn't always a core member and evident in terms of consistent dialogue within those public-private dialogue mechanisms. The second area is automation and digitization, not just in the customs space, as ACUDA and the customs declaration processing systems, particularly important, but the other government agencies, particularly SPS and standards authorities, and the use of eFITO, eCites, etc. And the most important and critical, I think, recovery initiative will be connecting those smaller systems to the ACUDA system in a seamless way. And finally, as we move into the recovery phase, it will be important for the reforms to be sustained and the National Trade Facilitation Committees to be reinforced and continue the partnership with the private sector and their leadership across government. Thank you, Lai.
Thank you. Roy.
Thanks, Lai, and thank you, Bill and JV and Stanley. Those are really good views. And I think just from a PACER Plus perspective, it provides an opportunity for a reset in the way we do business in the Pacific, especially to assist in recovering from COVID-19. In particular, the agreement creates new opportunities for sustainable investment and growth for the longer term. PACER Plus is a trade and investment agreement, and it's specifically tailored to the Pacific, using some of the global practices that Bill has mentioned and JV, and helps the small island states. I think that's the biggest thing, small island states and economies to assist with the growth. The good thing about PACER Plus, it covers a broad range of functions just by design, and it takes a holistic approach to things like economic growth, development, and some of those things that Bill talked about in terms of the private sector. We're looking at things like trade in goods, rules of origin, biosecurity, standards and conformance, things in trade and services, investment. As JV mentioned, transparency is quite a big one. And one of the core outcomes is to make the regional business environment smoother and friendlier. And looking at ACUDA as an automated system to help countries streamline some of the activities or some of the ways they do business. Private sector growth in the Pacific Island, as we know, in a lot of countries drives economic growth. So we can improve and support the private sector. That's going to bring a lot of support for governments, employment, welfare, those sort of things to help countries grow during this time in COVID. It also creates a closer, more uniform trade and investment area, and it allows foreign island countries which have ratified the agreement in particular, to share resources, including skills, specialization in labor, private sector capital to invest. And most importantly, the good thing about PACER Plus is that it aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals, which a lot of the countries in the region, in the Pacific, have signed up to. So, whaftai lava. Lai?
And thank you, Roy and the rest for that response to that question. So I may just go into the next questions we have, and thank you to the participants who are providing questions on the chat forum. We will come to you in just a minute, and we will make sure that we will answer those questions in the Q&A in the next 10 minutes or so. But just in the interest of time, and this is it's a general questions that we want to put to the panelists. We've heard about national approach. We've also heard about what's important about sustainability, about national ownership, We've also heard about coordinated border agency, but the questions that we want to pose, and this is, I think, from the context, particularly of the PACER Plus implementation unit, it's a regional agreement for regional integrations. How, in your view, can the Pacific expedite trade facilitation reforms? And this is the approach. What we want to hear from you is your view around national versus regional implementation approach. I think, Bill, in your initial comments, you had talked about the benefits of some of the regional approach, but how can we expedite trade facilitation reforms in that regard? Maybe just one response from each of the panelists in this before we move on to the next question. Again, just in the interest of time, just so to register to the participants as well. Thank you. I might start with JV. JV, with that.
Thank you, Lai. So the countries we work with in the Pacific, they're at different stages of implementing trade facilitation measures. So from Vanuatu, that has implemented a single window system, to others that are only beginning their automation project or their reform projects. In many countries, reform starts nationally, while others are compelled to undertake reform to fulfill regional obligations. And this was further accelerated by this pandemic. What I believe works well in favor of the Pacific region is that there is more cooperation than competition to make sure that no country is left behind. So national and regional implementation approaches actually run in parallel in many of the projects here. The beauty here is that countries like Vanuatu that are well advanced in their trade facilitation reforms can serve as the model for the others that have only started to embark on this initiative. And this can also serve as the regional template of what can be done. Like the reforms, the connection that Vanuatu has established among all the different border agencies. This is a model that can be replicated in the other Pacific Island countries. And we should also make use of the regional expertise that has been built over time to support the other Pacific Island countries, particularly with people having already the knowledge and being familiar with the environment where we operate. Also, we have a number of active technical assistance projects on trade facilitation, and this includes PACER Plus. And I guess, as Bill mentioned at the beginning, the onus is now on us, on the international and regional organizations, development and implementing partners, to coordinate, collaborate, and harmonize our implementation plans, considering that we will be meeting and working with the same sets of stakeholders and beneficiaries. Thank you, Lai.
Thank you, JV. Bill, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, thank you, Lai. The Pacific can definitely benefit from the economies of scale and implement at a regional level, common methodologies, tools, and practices, learning from each other. And I think the learning across countries, and particularly between the different levels of development, which JV just indicated, is evident across the Pacific, is an important consideration. And to this end, I'll just talk a little bit about the work that the World Bank's doing in partnership with PIFs to facilitate the development and design of the Pacific Regional Trade Facilitation Strategy. This strategy will be a living document, a living strategy that will anchor all the trade facilitation activity across the Pacific. It will connect to the Aid for Trade strategy that PIFs have already adopted. It will connect to the other regional initiatives like the e-commerce strategy, the national quality infrastructure work. And I think going forward, the broader digitization strategy for the Pacific will need to be clearly anchored to the regional trade facilitation strategy document once it's adopted. And finally, the work that we see by other regional organizations will be important to be anchored within the strategy. So particularly the Oceania Customs Organization and the work they're doing around the HS, as an example, and SPC, the work they're doing around maritime and in the quarantine space. Consultations are underway at the moment. We've done one regional workshop, so far 3 national consultations, with one for every country over the next 2 to 3 months. So please connect, you know, at the national level and get involved in providing your views around, you know, what would work from a regional perspective when implementing trade facilitation at the regional level. Thank you, Lai.
Thank you. Roy or Stanley, do you want to contribute to that question? Thank you.
I think maybe just quickly from the PACER Plus implementation unit, I think Bill and JV have mentioned about the different levels of development. And for us at the PACER Plus implementation unit, we're taking a particular focus at the national level. And I think developing national agencies at the national level to then help them to be able to, you know, compete or be part of that regional framework, that's always going to be really important. It's always hard to work at the regional level when your national agencies are still not quite where they should be. So I think for us at the PPIU, those are some of the things we're looking at where we can help and assist small island developing states at a national level to improve some of their national frameworks. And we know that by developing agencies at a national level, it will help them contribute to a regional level. So I think that's really important, just to focus in on those national level support, because as JV and Bill mentioned, there's quite a lot of regional support going on. You've got Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, which is the PIFS, that does the big regional strategy here in the Pacific region. But there's opportunity, I think, for the PACER Plus implementation unit is to actually focus in on helping agencies at a national level so that they're able to contribute at that regional level, and then also filter into contributing at that global level as well. Naka.
Thanks, Lai. Yeah, just to quickly add, and I'll echo what the fellow panelists have mentioned about national reform. I think I'll speak from experience that to allow us to be able to implement a single window project or that the system, it needs from a national level the agencies and including customs to have sound legislation frameworks. And for customs in Vanuatu, we adopted a brand new legislation back in 2013 before we embarked on the modernization projects initiatives that we had, which was to adopt the Ask the World system in 2017, and now the single window system. So definitely a sound legislation framework on the national level. And then once you start having these trade initiatives in place, we need a good governance structures in place, because it helps driving the reforms and the efforts to work with the agencies. It's with trade facilitation, it's not just customs, it's cross agencies. So having good governance structures in place would help drive those initiatives through. Thanks, Lai.
And thank you, panelists, for that question, sir. And to the participants, thank you for your questions, which we will just address. We just have one more questions before we close this, but before we wrap up with our final questions, we just want to provide you very shortly an overview of trade and gender in the Pacific.
Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Timor-Leste, and Vanuatu face unique challenges. The small island nations are detached from the major markets in the world and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. These challenges and cumbersome border processes add delays and increase costs to trade, making it difficult for Pacific Island countries to trade competitively. 1,500 men and women cross-border traders participated in a survey to identify the gender-specific barriers to trade facilitation. The survey showed that women in the Pacific region face greater challenges than their male counterparts. Fewer women are represented in trade associations. With the exception of Samoa, governments consult women less regularly when it comes to matters related to border processes. Fewer women are aware that declarations can be submitted electronically. Fewer women are aware that customs allow pre-declaration of shipments prior to arrival. The vast majority of both men and women traders are unaware of national trade facilitation committees in their countries. This data can help governments better understand the barriers to trade so that they can streamline border regulations and procedures, increase access to information, and give women equal access to the benefits of trade. The World Bank Group is committed to helping countries with their trade facilitation efforts to reduce the gender gap and create strong and competitive trade markets.
We hope it has provided some insight for the participants and the countries that hear in terms of the gender participation in trade, which leads us to our last question of the evening before we take questions and answers this afternoon, which is really about, in all of the discussions that you've discussed regional strategies and national and trade facilitation reforms. What, in your view, maybe perhaps just one, should be the trade facilitation priority in your extensive experience and work in the Pacific and through the countries? What, in your view, should be the trade facilitation priority for the Pacific in this post-COVID environment? I know we're still recovering from COVID, but perhaps just one priority that the Pacific can focus on in the coming months and in the year that is ahead. We will start with you, Roy, and then we'll go around the room then. Thanks.
I think for the PPA, one focus area is assisting countries at a national level and focusing on what particular things that they need. So I think for us, that's really where we need to be focusing on in terms of supporting and assisting countries going forward.
JV and Stanley, and then we'll wrap up with Bill. Thank you. Sorry, JV, I think you're muted. Thank you. Sorry, JV, I think there's a problem with your audio. If you just hold, and then maybe we can go on to Stanley and to Bill until we can get JV back on audio. Thank you.
Thanks, Lai. Just again, from my views, I would say all of the above. I think it's because I see all the priorities would be interconnected. But if I have to pick one, I think reform at the national level, as I mentioned earlier, in line with the WTO FTA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, across all the agencies concerned. And again, legislation reform and good governance would be good to have for any trade facilitation initiatives that the countries might want to come up with. Thanks, Lai.
Thank you, Stanley. JV, are you back online? Are you able?
Hello, Lai, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yes, sorry for that. Yeah, I have a list here, but I think I'll mention just a few of the priorities that we can focus on. I don't know if we can talk about the post-COVID environment. I think we will be living with COVID for quite some time. So I think some of the priorities should be to prepare to tackle future disruptive events and ensure that the supply chain continues. Second is scaling up customs digital transformation by making use of international standards developed by the WCO, UNECE, and other institutions regarding data format and cross-border customs transport and regulatory data exchange. Third one, I would say, is enhance the interoperability and data integration of the different systems. We need to ensure that there's uninterrupted shipping of goods by air, including e-commerce, and by sea. And lastly, I would say it would be the implementation of a common solution for regional cross-border data exchange. Thank you, Lai.
Yeah, Bill, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Lai. I guess the number one might be, which might encompass many others, is clear outcomes for traders, anchored around transparency and predictability. And sitting underneath that, the regional approach to public-private dialogue, so that partnership between the private and public sector stakeholders is going to be critical to ensure an efficient implementation of trade facilitation. And a clear role for the regional secretariats. And Roy, I really like the way that you've articulated, where you think the PACER Plus implementation unit, sits and where the added value might be. And it really complements, the regional secretariat. So I think that would work well. And then just to follow up on the video that we just watched, using the outcomes of the gender surveys that the World Bank Group has undertaken, to inform the design and sustainability of the trade facilitation initiatives, not only by the work that we're doing, but across all development partners, because there's clearly a gap. And just a final word around the gender gaps that we identified in the Pacific, they're actually common, globally. We've run that instrument across probably about 20 odd countries across the world now, and we're seeing very similar lack of access to information for women-led, owned or managed firms, real lack of involvement and access to trade facilitation committees and industry associations. So again, very important to round out the plans with that gender nexus in focus. Thank you, Lai.
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing your experiences. I think this evening we've been able to just lean into some of the key trade facilitation implementation activities, and then again, like I previously said, like national versus regional. And then again, in the interest of time, I think I'll just go right into the question and answers session now. And thank you. I see on the question and answer chat that there are some questions that have been answered. So I will just try and quickly take 3 or 4 of this question. And this question is particularly to Stanley. To what extent was the National Trade Facilitation Committee involved in the single window project? Perhaps if you'd like to answer that. Thank you. From Samoa.
Thank you, Lai, and thank you, Samoa, for the question. So the Vanuatu National Trade Facilitation Committee meets 3 times a year. It's chaired by the Minister of Trade. It has quite a big impact or mandate on the work that we do for trade, and it's cross-cutting. It includes tourism and whatnot. So it's a good platform that as from the single window project that we attend the meeting every time the committee sits, and there's always an agenda on a single window. So it could be just for us to give an update, and also we use that platform to get the mandate for to work with the agencies in the project. Because it's not just our decision in the project or the working group to approach an agency and decide to work with them. We get the mandate from the National Trade Facilitation Committee. And that goes down to even admin matters, because the team that we see at the project, we're not the project is not a the project team is not a full-time team. It's officers from agencies, including customs. So we use the NDTC or the Trade Facilitation Committee as the platform to get the mandate to get the officers on board the project team. So it plays quite an important role, and from the project perspective, we wouldn't be able to implement our reforms and initiatives if it wasn't for the Trade Facilitation Committee. Thank you.
And thank you, Stan, and I hope some of the sense answered your questions. And I think and one of the key themes too that have been constantly discussed today is about political will. And I think that experience that Sen is sharing is quite important for the rest of the Pacific Islands implementing automation project. There's a question for Bill. I think it is like summarizing the question. I think in terms of the projects that you've implemented in the Pacific, what indicators have been used to indicate its success or otherwise?
Thanks, Lai. It's a good question, and in the work that we do globally, but particularly in the Pacific, we look to identify what the constraints are through a kind of a diagnostic process. And around the Trade Facilitation Agreement, that's kind of a gap analysis and measuring a baseline of alignment with the Trade Facilitation Agreement. So just using that as an example, and we could do a similar thing, with the PACER Plus implementation as well. We have a tracking tool which is online and available to the National Trade Facilitation Committees to be able to track, the current status, the implementation of the reforms, and the short, medium, and long-term kind of targets that they can develop. This sits within the reform maps and the leadership and ownership, more importantly, by the National Trade Facilitation Committees for the implementation of the reforms. One particular reform we worked with Tonga on was around expedited shipments, particularly in preparation for the importation of the vaccines. And I'm sure that the structures put in place have been particularly useful in the current crisis. We measure that success by the increase in transparency, predictability, and coordination, from the beginning of the initiative to working with the National Trade Facilitation Committee and border agencies to identify the constraints and implement the solutions. So again, that is another way of measuring on the ground, the changes from the implementation of a particular initiative. So that these two ways. The third way is around indicators. At the project level, we have indicators, reduction in time, reduction in cost, reduction in inspections. These are indicators that are tracked depending on the initiative or the activity that we're working with the particular government on, like risk management as an example. So looking at what the objective might be in customs is going to be a little bit different from what it might be for quarantine. So, developing indicators that will actually show perhaps a decrease in inspections, but an increase in compliance. Just a few things. I could probably talk about this for quite a long time, so perhaps I'll leave it there, but happy to follow up with the questioner if more details needed, particularly for the Pacific. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you, Bill, for that for that response, and for the Pacific participants also, and the rest of the participants that are here. We are also registering your questions just in case we're not able to answer all of them this afternoon, and then hope to provide links in which to the panelists today to be able to provide some response. I think there's a couple of questions on Esikuda World and its interface with biosecurity systems, and I know the panelists have seen this. Perhaps JV, very quickly, just in response to one of those questions on Esikuda World. I think the benefits have already been articulated, but perhaps just the interface with other, particularly on biosecurity. Thanks.
Thanks, Lai. So I just answered the question in the chat box, but So in the Asikuda program, we have been in discussions with a lot of other international organizations and institutions. And this includes the system providers of eFITO on how we can integrate or interface eFITO with Asikuda and make the SPS data available for customs clearance. Discussions are ongoing, and we hope to finalize the agreement and start the development of that interface. So eFITO is just one of the many other systems that we are looking to talk to and interface.
Thank you, JV. And perhaps and very interesting questions. And now generally, and then I will ask the last question to Roy, who is hosting this this webinar. Tonga, there is a question from Tonga. So a question from Tonga. Sorry. Just in terms of what initiatives and support, if any of your organizations are implementing to help Tonga recover from the volcanic eruption and the impact COVID has on trade facilitation. Just the general comments from any of the panelists, particularly to Roy or Bill or JV. Thank you.
Thanks, Lai. I think Bill was already touched on it, and maybe Bill will be able to answer this, given that the World Bank is doing quite a bit of work in the region around expedited shipments. So, Bill, I hand over to you. I think you touched on this already.
Thanks, Roy. Yeah, certainly we're available to provide support to Tonga, across specific measures that would help at the moment, like expedited shipments, special regimes, and faster clearance, increasing efficiency in the face of the COVID crisis. Additionally, the World Bank is providing emergency financing, development policy, operations and loans. And I note the timing for a recent loan to board was in December. And so the money's become and is available, for Tongan government to access. So I think that's happening. I guess the constraint, is around access. Perhaps, in the virtual environment, given the communications are not completely restored. But certainly, please reach out, to me, and I can certainly, pull together whatever needs to be organised to provide support around cross-border trade facilitation, and for what makes the most sense at the moment, and any other issue that the World Bank can help with. We can certainly find the right contacts and the right team. We have, a lot of people in the region, and our country economist for Tonga. I was talking to him today, so he's available as well. So perhaps I'll leave it there, Roy. But yeah, thanks.
And thank you, Bill and Roy, for that response. I'm afraid time has caught up with us. We wanted to keep this under just an hour, and we're coming just about that this evening. But thank you. Perhaps. And I think we've also responded to all of your questions. And if you do still have any pressing questions, you can reach out to us on our website, which I will talk about at the end of this session. One final comments. I think if I can just ask the panelists one final observations or comments to the panelists, and just bear with us as we bring this session to a close. JV, maybe we can start with you and Stanley, and then Bill, and then we'll wrap it up with Roy's comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lai. Once again, I'd like to thank the PACER Plus Implementation Unit for having us in this panel. And we continue to support and work together with the different countries here in the Pacific. We'll continue to coordinate with the different customs administrations as well as the regional organizations, and of course with our partners in the World Bank. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lai. I think I'd just like to add on what JV mentioned earlier about building on regional experiences. I'll talk from a single window project perspective. When we embark on this project, we have no idea what a single window system looks like. And I'm sure a lot of us in the region would like to know about that as well. So, feel free to reach out, and we're happy to share our experience, not just in single window, but just in modernization initiatives or projects. And we'll be happy to share our experience. So we're not saying we're the experts here, but I think you will learn one thing or two from our experience. Thank you.
Lai, just a final thought from me is really, the key mechanism, I think, to effective implementation of trade facilitation in the Pacific is going to be coordination and collaboration between not only between development partners, but national level ministries and departments and then regional organizations in a matrix that is active, that is updated, and is sustained. And I welcome the opportunity to talk about how we can make that happen, particularly in partnership with PPIU and the regional organizations and our colleagues in UNCTAD, OCO, etc., PIFs and NSPC. And a final thank you to Roy and the team, Lai, for your great moderation, and to my fellow panelists for a really exciting Talanoa. And I wish all panels were as exciting as this. Thank you.
Yeah. Look, I'd just like to thank everyone for their participation, but also for Bill, JV, Stanley, for coming on board and sharing your experience. Really happy and excited that we've got quite a lot of participants, even though there's a big time difference. Bill, it's really early in the morning where you are, and thank you so much for staying up. And, it's always a challenge when there's a time difference, but what it shows, and I just want to reiterate what everyone else has said, is the Pacific is quite a crowded region. There's so many donors, there's so many partners, there's so many people working in the region. But what this panel, I hope to show is that if we're working together like we are here in this Talanoa, it will provide better opportunities for the Pacific, but also reduce the strain on resources that we're all competing for. And I think that's going to be really important going forward, to be able to collaborate and work together. So, I thank the World Bank, UNCTAD, Stanley for coming on board, and also Julian and his team for organizing this side event as part of the big global trade facilitation event. I know it's really early in the morning and over there, so I really appreciate everyone's time. So thank you so much to Lai as well for moderating, and for my team and the UNCTAD team that's working behind the scenes to make this all happen. So thank you so much, everyone, for your participation, and to my fellow panelists, looking forward to continuing our collaboration.
And thank you, Roy and the panelists. It's not finished yet. Just bear with us as we're bringing this to an end. We want to, again, because as Roy had indicated at the beginning, that PACER Plus is the new kid on the block, the PACER Plus implementation unit, and we think it is quite important for us also to socialize with the work that we do here at the unit. So one last video before I bring all of this to an end. So please just bear with us for 2 minutes before we finally close off this session. Thank you.
Welcome to Mailelani. As a small Pacific business owner based in Samoa, it gives me great confidence to know that Aotearoa has long had special relationships with the Pacific Islands. PACER Plus is very exciting because it opens up so many options in how our Pacifica produce can lead to better ways of life right across every community. Historically, there have been many difficulties getting our unique goods and products onto the shelves of our trusted wealthier nations. But PACER Plus will provide new opportunities for Pacific countries to export. And New Zealand and Australia will work with Pacific countries to develop the infrastructure needed for supply and demand, helping to create a more even playing field. Our long-standing relationship with New Zealand and Australia will forge new bonds, especially with the development assistance, which will help boost our capacity to trade and increase the range of quality products in the Pacific. For our young Pacific Islanders, PACER Plus creates a connection back to our ancestors, placing opportunities on the horizon, much like they would have seen when they first ventured across the great Moana Nui Akio. We are one Pacific, working together to create opportunities so all of our people can thrive and prosper.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our trade Talanoa today, and we hope that there is no need for me to summarize what we have been talking about today. But I guess this video really has brought to light, who are we doing this for? And I think that's, most of the conversations has been about public sector reforms. I think it's quite important. And Bill had said that in one of his interventions, that there are clear outcomes for traders so that we can explore our export opportunities for our region. And so that video is supposed to bring us all to that. Who are we doing this for, particularly for the traders and the private sector? I, on behalf of the PACER Plus Implementation Unit, would like to take this opportunity to thank ANTED, particularly Julia, for availing this opportunity to share our experience across the Pacific. I would like to thank the panelists for your valuable contributions and to all the participants for joining us online for this event. For more information on PACER Plus, we know we could not exhaust it in 1 hour, and to the rest of the organizations that are here, we invite you to visit our website at pacerplus.org, and you can also find us on social media by searching PACER Plus. That brings us to the end of our Talanoa. A very good evening to those of us in the Pacific, and a good day to the others across the globe. Fafitai lava, and we wish you well for the rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Laurie. Bye.